So I wanted to acknowledge your patience and stamina. We are squeezing you into this room like sardines, and you're being very patient with us. We've been filling your head with all sorts of new information, and I hope you don't have too much trouble digesting it over the next few days. But we wanted to introduce you to the range of ideas that are being used to address this predicament that we're in, where our cultural lifestyle and economy is sort of clashing with the limits to the planet, and one of the symptoms is increasing CO2 and methane and global warming, but it's a symptom, and we're trying to address the root cause with some of the ideas that we're sharing with you today. As I said a little bit earlier, Lincoln Smith and Ben Friton are having a lot of fun in their backyard. They're on 10 acres of land, and I'm going to let them describe what's happening. I think Lincoln's going to focus on the above ground and all the stuff you can eat and a few other things, and Ben is going to tap into some of his wealth of knowledge as a soil scientist. And I guess somebody said this before, but they're growing hope on their land there, right? This is Ben's daughter, Hope. So here's Lincoln.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for coming. My name's Lincoln Smith. I'm a forest gardener from Bowie. It's about 20 or 30 minutes from here, just east of the Beltway. And I'd love it if you wanted to stop by sometime. What we're trying to do is discover how we can grow food and other supplies for people in a forest-based agricultural system that restores biodiversity and all the ecosystem services to that piece of land right where we grow our food. I wanted to put the blinds up partly just because of daylight, of course, but also because that tree right outside the window, that's a red oak tree. And it is an amazing source of food if you know how to use it. Believe it or not, the oaks of this ecosystem, that's a native plant, produce a staple nutritional profile food in a quantity per acre somewhat comparable to wheat, which is the world's most widely grown crop and arguably does more to displace ecosystems than almost any other human activity, the growing of our grass crops. So how can we work with this forest ecosystem that we find ourselves in to produce the food that we need, restore the environment, and possibly even have healthier people to go with that, as to sort of paraphrase Mr. Rodale. So I'm going to just pace it pretty quick because, like a lot of you, I could definitely give a couple of days talking on this. So I'm just going to rattle through it, and forgive me if it's a little fast, but I'd love to chat with you afterwards if you have questions. All right, so here's our ecosystem, the mighty temperate forest, somewhat fragmented right now. We need to bring it back. We can't do that by just setting aside lands where people aren't allowed anymore. I mean, I think there is a great value in the national parks and the setting aside of land, like no humans allowed for the most part to restore those ecosystems. But if we really want to do this in a meaningful way, we need to reintegrate humans with the ecosystem so that the very lands that are sustaining us and providing everything we need are the ecosystem. We're based on it as closely as we can. Tillage agriculture, just for reference. And I'd like to couch this in terms of, I don't have to worry about what my family eats like so many people in the world do and have throughout history. And a lot of that is because of this system, the industrialized tillage agricultural system. So I actually have a lot of gratitude for this system. I can't sit here and try something new without relying on this and having the stability of what this is bringing in. And we're all relying on it. We're benefiting from this system all the time. We know we need to move beyond it, but the people that developed this system had a lot of good intentions of trying to help feed people. So let's apply our ingenuity, the same ingenuity that created these incredible combine harvesters, to now accepting the responsibility that humans are the main ecological force on the globe, and design the new system with just as much ingenuity to produce the food we need and restore ecosystems. All right, so the forest garden model, or agroforestry, food forest, is very polycultural. So we're growing a lot of different species together to occupy different niches. agriculture is the only place where you find monocultures with one species growing in vast blocks and nothing else. And that is obviously an inefficient way to make use of the biological potential of that land, because one species only does one set of nutrient cycling and interacts with one set of insects and other animals, etc. So we grow plants of all different sizes and strategies for life together in the forest garden, and trying to maximize beneficial interactions and keep it just sane enough that we can harvest it with some degree of efficiency. There's a map of the property. Like I said, it's polycultural, but it is fairly organized actually, and I'll get a little into how it looks. Kind of like an overgrown field, but it is structured. So what we're trying to do is, like, obviously, if you leave any piece of land alone, including this road right out here, if you left that road alone for long enough, it would turn into a forest. That is what the land does around here. And so we're trying as much as possible to stand back and observe what this land does, what it produces on its own without us doing anything, and then work with it. We tweak it. It is not a no maintenance system by any means. It is pretty high maintenance. It's a lot of labor. But we're trying to work with the ecosystem and what it's producing as much as possible. For example, there's a lot of persimmon trees that have just popped up. American persimmon fruit. Has anybody ever gotten to try American persimmon fruit? A few of you. If you haven't, you should. It's a wonderful fruit if you eat it when it's fully ripe. We didn't. Yeah, okay. It's amazing when it's fully ripe. So if you've had a bad experience, try again. We didn't know we were going to be persimmon farmers when we first came on. I didn't know those trees were there. But a year or two in, here come all these amazing wild persimmon trees. So we're trying to work with that as much as possible. We grow everything, including the apple tree on this slide. We're not strictly native in what we grow. But if it's growing wild without anybody doing anything, we have a special respect for that, and we try to emphasize it. A couple of our activities include, we have a small CSA or farm share that is starting this coming Friday. We're not really panicking. We're going to be fine. The wine cap mushrooms are fruiting like crazy right now, and they may be all done by the time the first. Anyway, we'll see. Yeah, so we have it's very small, but we have 15 members this year, and we have some pretty cool stuff in there, like you see on the screen: nettles, hazelnut, shiitake mushrooms, sorrel, various herbs. And it changes as the year goes on. Ugly apples, which taste better, and other kinds of mushrooms, etc. So we're just trying to see what we can produce from this forest. And having the CSA really causes us to focus. Like, we have to deliver this food. In our case, it's every other week. It's been a great and challenging journey. The other thing we do is we design edible parks around the DC region. Recently, like last year, we had the ribbon cutting at a place in Hyattsville, which is had a really good first year. The purpose of these things is not to feed the whole neighborhood from that little green space, but to give the kids in that neighborhood the chance to forage some of their own food and learn about growing these plants and reconnect. Like, urban people often lack that pretty fundamental human connection. So it's been really fun to see, like, the volunteer organizer. There's the plan for the site, and then the volunteers putting the garden in. The volunteer coordinator at Hyattsville said that she had a group of high schoolers out there, and they were all gobbling up kale and gobbling up sorrel that was growing in that garden, and that to me is incredibly satisfying. That's what we're hoping for. If they're helping grow it, they're more likely to eat it. And some of these places, like, that's a modest, a neighborhood of modest homes and mixed in with light industry, and there's very little green space in the whole neighborhood together, and they don't have very much space in the individual yards to grow fruit. So it's a pretty neat opportunity. We also do forest to table dinners. We had the great fortune to work with a chef named Michael Costa, who's the head chef at Zaytinya, which is probably around near here somewhere. I'm not very good at DC geography. It's Chinatown. So he's a head chef at a Jose Andres restaurant. He just volunteered to come play around with our forest garden ingredients. So we did this in the fall. We have our next one coming up in June. Love to have you out if you want. He made all kinds of amazing things, and I'm just going to showcase a few of the foods, including the acorn stuff. I like to belabor acorns because they represent the potential of forest agriculture to help feed the world. That's acorn gel with fermented sweet potato green on shiso leaf, which was really cool, better than it sounds. There's some shiitake. There's some shiitake mushrooms coming along. That is acorn falafel, which the chef says was the best falafel he's ever made, and he makes a lot of falafel. So that was pretty cool. And he also made acorn granola and acorn pawpaw bread, and you name it. It was like a 12-course meal. So there's that. That's been neat from the point of view of we've been working on the horticulture side of this project for quite a while. It's 5 years old. And now we're finally connecting the horticulture with humans and like people. I don't make very good food for the most part. I mean, if the ingredients are good enough, it's okay. But to connect people with like a really wonderful experience of eating from the forest has been really satisfying. And I could definitely go into a lot of details about how the forest garden philosophy works, but the basic idea, as we said, that land turns into forest around here. We stop that, a lot of the biological potential with most of our farming and lawn and a lot of what we're doing. So can we work with the forest ecosystem? And it's interesting that in terms of biomass production, like which is, I would guess, proportional to carbon sequestration, the forest is at its most productive when it's not fully mature. At least this is what forest ecologists tell us. A fully mature, closed canopy dark forest is not making quite as much biomass, sequestering as much carbon per year as a mid to late successional forest. So forest gardening is not, a forest garden is not necessarily a dark place, like from a shade point of view. We continuously thin the forest and open up light coming into the lower layers so that we can grow these plants that like a certain amount of sun in the lower layers. So like we planted our main canopy trees at a 40-foot spacing with the intention of removing about half of them 15 or 20 years into the project when they start to close the canopy together. So we're continuously opening the layers back up so we can grow multi-story food production. The other thing, though, besides food that we're focusing on is building soil. About half of the.
Conducting a meeting for a long period of time. If you need to continue the meeting, press 1 now. If not, I'll end the meeting.
I don't know where that's coming from, but anyway. So, yes, thank you, technology. So, am I mic'd right now? No? Okay, I'll just yell really loud for a little while. We're also working on building soil. So we grow the plants that are for people to use, but we also grow nitrogen-fixing plants that accumulate minerals. Because this, about 5 of the 10 acres has been tobacco for like 300 years and extremely low organic matter, as we've heard people talking about. And one of the ways to accelerate the building of the soil is to grow nitrogen-fixing plants like the wonderful native partridge pea there in the yellow and the red clover, which is not native, but it is a cheap nitrogen fixer that you can get in bulk for seed. We also have, we've tried to collect all the native nitrogen fixers we can. Another cool example is the smooth alder plant, which is building soil. And there's false indigo bush, which fixes nitrogen, and ninebark, which is a neat insectary plant. We also make a lot of compost. So I think the whole carbon equation is fascinating to ponder. I don't know what the effect of making compost is on putting carbon in the soil for the long term, but it does make our plants happy. So I think it's probably helping. We bring in hundreds of tons of wood chips every year, and oh, thanks. Like maybe we bring in, my wife picks up coffee grounds every day from one Starbucks, and it adds up to 6 tons plus of coffee grounds per year, and it's great fertilizer. You should do the same at your local coffee shop. All right, and then one story about how like a monoculture, growing just one crop species, is a great way to grow pests of that crop species. You're creating a perfect environment for them. So there was this cool study published in a Canadian entomology journal where they planted a native understory into existing apple orchards. So these are in unsprayed conditions. In the apple orchards that were just a monoculture, you have the orange arrows representing the pests that damage the crops, and then you have a few predators that eat your pests, like spiders or birds or assassin bugs. I'll show you a picture of an assassin bug in a minute if you're not familiar with that guy. But in the orchards where they planted in a native understory of winterberry holly and viburnum and various things, what that does is it massively increases the biodiversity of insect life on that site, because a lot of insects they have specific requirements related to a particular plant. So the biodiversity of insects went up. So then if you're a predator, that environment is now much more suitable for you to make a living, like if you're a bird that eats insects. So they found the net effect was way more predators and less crop damage in net. Again, this is without insecticides being sprayed on either of the test plots. So we plant a bunch of native understory things that are just known to be good insect habitat. Then you can let me know how I'm doing on time. And a few of the players that are in the forest garden that we enjoy. We, of course, only understand a fraction of what's going on in the forest, but we do know that this place produces forest, and if we can try to understand as much and work with as much as possible, we'll probably be on the right track. I think that's I really enjoyed the discussions of reductionist science, the importance and the usefulness of reductionist science, and the limitations of it. And I think one thing that reductionism can give us is the impression that we fully understand something, when in fact we only understand one slice of it based on the questions that we're asking about it. So I'll tell you about a few cool interactions that we've observed on the forest garden site, while recognizing that each one that we observe probably hides another 1,000 that we don't understand yet. So if we can just try to use all the right puzzle pieces, hopefully it'll mostly take care of itself. That's our philosophy anyway. So here's a wasp named Scolia dubia that is nectaring on goldenrod. This is a real helpful creature because it parasitizes Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles are a big pain on our cherry trees and grapes and other things. But you can see that in this slide, it is not parasitizing a Japanese beetle. It is nectaring on goldenrod. The adult will lay its egg into a Japanese beetle larva in the soil, but when it's flying in this half of its life cycle, it needs nectar. So our cherry trees and all that need the diversity of that goldenrod growing in the site. Otherwise, you don't have the population of Scolia dubia, blue-winged wasp, to blunt the impact of the Japanese beetle population. And we have seen it blunt considerably. It was terrible in the first 2 years, and we haven't had nearly the Japanese beetle issues for the more recent 3 years. Of course, there's more that goes into it than just what we can observe. We may have a bad year coming up, but in general, the diversity is up, and we expect that on average, the plague of pests should be blunted by just more players in the system. Other players include, there he is, that's an assassin bug. They're really scary, they're great. It's a native insect, and I actually even saw him eating a Japanese beetle, which I was very excited to discover. When you have a native insect eating an introduced pest, that's pretty exciting for me. And again, that insect has its own habitat requirements, is not happy in a mowed, insecticide-doused monoculture apple orchard, as might surprise you. Here's another helper. All the little white things in that picture are spider webs. Actually, this was taken at a similar time of year to right now. When the dew falls at the right moment and the sun is shining at the right angle, you can see thousands and thousands of these particular spiders. And that's just one of the many. No, sorry, all right. Don't worry, we have paths and things, and you don't wide paths. You can stay back from the spiders if you come visit the forest garden. But that's just one of many different types of spider. So if you're a pest insect trying to make your way across the site, you have a decent chance of not making it, which is fantastic. And then I thought this was kind of neat because we put down native seed mixes everywhere, and we don't tend them or anything, but it's just neat to see how with one mix across the different parts of the site, different things will come up just based on the soil. And this particular little composition we didn't do anything with. We just put down the seed and it comes up and supports the biodiversity that we're looking for to make the whole forest garden more resilient. And that's just a small fraction of things. We actually do have a deer fence around that, so that guy on the lower left is outside the deer fence, wishing he could get in. But we're a little out of balance with our white-tailed deer right now. We need wolves back East Coast.
Do you have
Or we-
any invasive species like the British ivy?
We do have a lot of invasive species on the site. I'll give you one example of what we do with as we move on, but the basic rule is we remove it when we have something to plant in that niche. So I don't wholesale remove all the multiflora from the site because I don't have nearly the labor power to get that done. But when we're ready to plant, if that multiflora is crowding something that we're trying to go, then it goes because we have something to come in and fill that niche. I just like the invasives. But I have some appreciation for the invasives. Every plant is building biomass and doing something. So even though we would rather it would be more diverse without the invasives, we tolerate them, and we really, from a practical point of view, can't get rid of all of them. All right, so I was mentioning to somebody over lunch, like the horticulture side is really fun, and I did come to this from a plant geek side point of view, but getting the people in the garden is really what brings a forest garden to life. And I just so that I'm not, I'm not sugarcoating this too much, or somebody said, appreciated one of the farmers' comments this morning about what it is to farm. Yesterday, I had some friends visit the forest garden, and it was super hot and muggy. They're not familiar with being outside all that much, like most people. So they didn't have hats or very good clothes or whatever. And we went around and we ate some dandelion leaves, which are extremely bitter, and some other things that they're not used to. And it was not necessarily, I think they enjoyed it, but it wasn't a perfect experience by any means. It wasn't like the Garden of Eden where you're lying in a hammock and having fruit fall into your mouth or something. So I think like getting people trained in again, like retrained to be part of the ecosystem. I mean, I encounter it with myself and my own family all the time. It's just, it's a skill that we've lost. So retraining the people to use the particular foods and live the life that is integrated with the forest is probably the bigger challenge than actually just growing the forest garden. So it's a fun challenge, but it does present, like take the bitter dandelion leaves. We used to have a lot of bitters in our diet, and it's really good for us, but our industrial food system has engineered most of the bitterness out of our diet, and we're suffering health effects as a result of that. And people can be retrained to enjoy bitters, but it takes some doing. It's not the most intuitive thing for a lot of people. All right, so just on the people. And then one example, I'll skip through this, but one example of an invasive plant that we have is the Bradford pear tree, or the species is Callery. But if you buy yourself a pear tree, it will come to you already grafted on Callery pear. So it's a good rootstock. It makes an unusable fruit, but you can graft it. You can cut them down from small up to big, even if you have a foot-thick Bradford pear tree. You can graft a good fruiting European or Asian pear onto that. We have thousands of these things coming up in the site already, and rather than dig them all out, we cut some of them down and graft them, and we can produce this type of fruit. So that's an example of using an annoying invasive plant, and we do this. There's a few other examples like that on the site. So each invasive requires it. Or we have another invasive is Japanese honeysuckle, and we have one of our volunteers harvests that and makes baskets out of it. So the best way to decimate a population of something is to find something for humans to do with it, right? If we could start selling the honeysuckle baskets like iPhones or something, soon we would have no honeysuckle left. And just another couple of fun players. We have the native passion fruit growing there. It's amazing. There's a pawpaw. Anybody ever had a pawpaw? Yeah, they're really good. Clove currant, that's a native currant. Grows pretty well. Fruits in the shade. Those wine caps, they're fruiting like crazy right now. Shiitake mushrooms. And of course I have to finish with acorns because they really do. They're the most overlooked food in America. They were a staple food for, well documented in California because that food culture persisted until a lot more recently than the food culture here on the East Coast. But throughout acorns range around the world, they've been used to varying degrees and sometimes as the staple foundation of the whole diet. So for us to be completely ignoring them, there's going to be probably with that tree 200 to 300 pounds of acorns on the ground in a mast year, right here on the sidewalk. It's all going to just get swept down the storm drain. all acorns are usable. They all have tannin in them, so they're quite labor intensive to process. But tannin is water soluble, and you can rinse that out. Everywhere you have traditional acorn use, there's different methods and variations on how you deal with the tannin.
Including live oak?
Including live oak, yep. That's a pretty tiny acorn, so it's pretty labor intensive. It's a very oily acorn though. Acorn oil is amazing. It's similar to olive oil in a lot of ways. So there's a few. Acorn does not have gluten in it, so any of the puffy looking things at the back of that slide are mixed with white flour. I particularly like the chips in the front. That's just straight acorn. You really get the flavor of it. But yeah, no gluten, so no rising and no fluffiness. But really tasty. Yeah, we grow hazelnuts. Yep. Great, so that's a little bit about the forest garden. And then, and I just want to give Hope just a second or two. Hope has a patch. This is Ben's daughter, Hope. And my two daughters and her each have their own patch in the forest garden. And so Hope just was going to tell a little bit about what she's growing there or whatever. Go ahead.
My name is Hope, and some things I'm growing in my patch are strawberries, and I'm growing lots of herbs, including mint. I'm growing a really good type of mint called anise hyssop. It's sweet and
Licoricey.
And licoricey. That's what I said. And I'm also growing veggies like carrots, although it didn't turn out good.
You win some, you lose some, right? Some things don't work, but that's okay, right?
I'm growing garlic or onions, and I'm also growing a type of cherry called Nankin cherry. It's a type of bush cherry, and the cherries are about that small, and they have pits inside of them, and they're sort of tart.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you here today. And okay, check, yes, great. And I'm particularly appreciative of all of the presentations that I've had an opportunity to come and watch today. The work that I do and all of us, we're standing on the shoulders of so many people that have come before us, and some of which you've been hearing today. And my whole world shifted when I started learning about the soil ecosystems that have allowed ecosystems to persist. And when I started learning about these ecosystems, I started to realize that they operate on very different wavelengths than humanity seems to at this point. First off, in a time scale, when you look at the length of time it takes for a thriving ecosystem to come into balance, it's different time scales in different places in the world, but it takes a while. And particularly here on the east coast of the United States, we have one of the most contagious ecosystems in the entire world. Like he said, if you let any space go in this region for enough time, it is going to become a forest. And in fact, if it's not asphalt and it's bare ground, it's going to happen way faster. Within 5 years, you're going to start seeing saplings and 10-foot tall little saplings growing. Yet, here we are in one of the most fertile ecosystems on the planet, with rainfalls that are the envy of many places in the world. And what are we doing with it? We're using it predominantly to grow corn. And I came to these realizations about land use through a few different mechanisms. One was the recognition of the illusion of choice. So when we go to the supermarket and we see thousands of different brands and logos and all of these things, we assume that we're actually sourcing our foods from a variety of different places. And the reality is that they are controlled by the same 8 to 10 corporations. And because of the centralization of agriculture, and particularly in the corporate world, what we are seeing is that over and over again, we are choosing economic efficiency over the perpetuation of ecosystems that we rely upon in order to survive. And just to give you an example of that, I'll talk about California's Central Valley, which has already been discussed here today. Is it playing? There we go. So California's Central Valley is a place where we produce this little sliver, 60% of all agricultural value in the United States. A place that is running out of water, and when you zoom in on it, you can see something eerily familiar. To me, this looks like an Excel spreadsheet. And this Excel spreadsheet is consisting of a whole bunch of fruits and vegetables that represent over 90% of that vegetable's production in the entire United States. Now, when each of these decisions are made for each of the squares that you see in this system, there are very few things taken into account except for what is the economic viability of me growing this crop in this square at this time. And the economic viability doesn't take into account a lot of things, i.e. the amount of water that is available, or certainly sustaining a water table. It doesn't take into account the human cost in everything from the labor that's being used in these systems. As long as it fits within the pluses and minuses on a spreadsheet, we have been largely willing to accept some of these drawbacks that occur. And we ignore some of the environmental collateral effects of those systems. Now, one specific example is where I'm going next, which are dairy CAFOs in Southern California in the Central Valley. Now, talk about a very specific way to mine water from a region. Now, this dairy is not just being produced. All these brown squares, you see them, all of those are concentrated dairy operation. Now, dairy, of course, the milk in and of itself, is largely water. And we are shipping this dairy around the world. Now, take it a step further. We've talked about this today. One of the reasons why we started consuming meat as a species is they were able to consume things in an ecosystem that we aren't able to consume. And then we can consume their byproducts like the meat itself or dairy, other things like that. But we've taken the animals out of the ecosystem and we've now centralized them in these CAFOs. And this is the result. We've centralized the food produced for humans to very small regions and basically decided that an entire region of the United States should be turned into a corn growing Excel spreadsheet. So this is all corn. I just zoomed into the corn belt, and the vast majority of this GMO, which means that the vast majority of this is sprayed with things like glyphosate and a number of other things. And then all of the soil that is lost, all of the pesticide residues that persist in that soil, all go into these arteries which feed the Mississippi River. And then that Mississippi River goes down all the way to the bay, to the Gulf of Mexico. And that Gulf of Mexico is experiencing many of the collateral effects of all of these mixes of pesticides that are making their way down the river. Now, we take that corn and then we ship it to places like this. So the reason I'm showing you this imagery is not so much that you need to see it in order to understand it, but perhaps it makes it a little more real to you. It certainly did for me. This technology, I believe, is extraordinary. This is Google Maps, where I'm just kind of dancing around, making different points that I can go around and just show how closely these different systems exist to each other. You can also go back in time in any given site and see satellite imagery of any site basically in the world through time. Here is one example of that. Now, we produce a lot of meat in this country, and we do it in these CAFOs, but that's not enough. This is the Amazon rainforest, and this is a time lapse. There is now an engine that any of you can go onto called Earth Engine. You just go into Google Earth and type in time lapse, or go into Google, type in Earth time lapse, and you can go anywhere on Earth and see a time lapse from 1984 to today of what it all has looked like, what has changed over multi-generations. This is the first time in human history that we have the ability to see multi-generational collateral effects of the decisions that we're making. And this is dark green turning into light green in the Amazon. That is the Amazon being turned into meat, corn and soy for meat. Again, so just full disclosure, I'm a vegan, but that does not mean that I'm a proponent of veganism. I believe that being a vegan is an extremely difficult thing to do. If you choose to do it, great for you. But I believe, much like many of the people here, that if you're going to consume meat, the most important thing that you need to do for your personal health and for the health of the planet is to know where it has come from and how it is raised, and that it is part of an ecosystem, not something excluded from an ecosystem and where you have to destroy more ecosystems in order to mass feed in that one space. So now I just want to talk a little bit about human perspective a little bit here. This is a video of an anthropologist flying over the Amazon from a documentary called Human Planet that the BBC aired. Awesome documentary series if you ever get the chance. He's flying over the Amazon in order to find uncontacted communities living in the Amazon so he can prove their existence in order to show people in societies like ours, which are increasingly putting pressure on destroying the Amazon in order to make one generation's worth of profits over something that could persist over indefinitely. So here are images of an uncontacted tribe. The anthropologist that you're seeing in this plane has actually been speared through the neck by these people. He survived it, and he does not blame them for what they did, because he knows that oftentimes an interaction with a white person means certain death. So I just want to know if you guys see what I see here. It's a thriving food forest in and around their community. These are people that are living with the ecosystem in which they currently live. Now, it's still a tough life. I'm not trying to make it all roses. In fact, another documentary this anthropologist made said that because they're getting pushed out of their communities where they have now cultivated their sustenance near and around them, they are being tracked down by jaguars and many other things. This can be a very hostile environment, which maybe gives us a window into why many of our ancestors, and maybe why we still do, cut down forests. That these were places that were wild, unknown, scary, often could lead to death because of predators. So I certainly don't want to demean every decision that we've made as a species this far, but I do want to recognize that there is another way to live. Lastly, on the Google time lapse, this is the Aral Sea, fourth largest lake in the world, and it dried up in 2007. And The reason is quite simple. We're about to zoom in here. This is the rivers that have been diverted to grow cotton. This was designed by the Soviet Union and has been expanded since then, and now this goes on the global market. In fact, in this room are fibers from cotton from this region, as is guaranteed. Now, it is the first time that we actually have the technology to look for the carrying capacity of a piece of land. If a piece of land has the capability, both in water, 1 in 10 major rivers is no longer reaching its end in the world. We can actually look at what the water availability are in regions. And yes, it's not going to be equal. It's not going to mean that every region is going to be able to grow the most profitable crop. But if that's all we're looking at, we're going to be in really big trouble, and we already are because of that mentality. So here you see it drying up. Now, what comes with that, and what you can't see in this picture, is that all of the sediment in the bottom of that lake, high salt content and very high pesticide residues from that cotton growing, and it's all getting lifted and blown through many regions, including other agricultural regions that are degrading their lands. So what we have to really understand about some of these cycles that we've been talking about today, everything from the transpiration cycles that result in rainfall in other places. Right now, we look at the drought in Somalia that's going on and the famine that happened there, that's happening there, and what happened last year in Ethiopia as somehow a Somali problem or an Ethiopian problem. The reality is that the rainfalls that they are relying upon in those regions fall outside of their borders. So ecological systems do not recognize the very borders that we happen to draw on maps. So here is a map of something that ecology does follow. So this is from the work of Susan Simard, a hero of mine, just mapping one small area's fungal networks, mycorrhizal fungal networks. And the reason why I bring this up is because, again, we've never had the technology to study these things before. In fact, the Amazonian community that we just saw, they don't have a word for microbe. Just kind of put that in perspective. Microbes are a very new thing to us. In fact, 150 years ago, we discovered the first pathogen. And when you start thinking about how vast the microbial world is, you understand that you can't just look at a microbe and think it's cute and decide you're going to study that. Instead, what we did was we studied the things that were killing us and the things that were killing our plants. We studied pathogens. We didn't have an understanding of what a whole sound microbiological ecosystem might look like. So what we did is we used what we had in our arsenal, which was largely chemistry. So again, I understand why we went down these paths, and in fact, we couldn't see the collateral effects of using the kind of systems that we have until very recently, when we've become 5 billion to 7.4 billion people. Now the same systems cannot be applicable anymore. We've got to make a shift. And I just want to show one more thing, which is a mycorrhizal fungi and a nematode. This is a root-feeding nematode that was captured by a mycorrhizal fungi using a glue that takes sugars from the plant and basically coats this glue in those sugars. And the root-feeding nematode assumed that it was actually penetrating a root, when in fact, it was a fungus that was there to capture it. Now, if you spray a fungicide because you have a specific fungal pest, are you just killing one fungus, that one pathogenic fungus? You're probably killing a whole host of the likely 25,000 species per gram of soil that lives in a healthy ecosystem. Likewise, we've thought of nematodes as a pathogenic, we only thought of them as pathogens because we saw that there were problems in plants and that these specific nematodes were the cause of the problem. Turns out that there are many different kinds of nematodes. There's bacterial feeding nematodes, fungal feeding nematodes, nematode feeding nematodes. So if we spray a nematicide, who are we killing? Are we just killing the pathogen? Of course not. We're also killing other things. This is part of the immune system that nature has created. Why a forest can grow without needing pesticides, or any thriving ecosystem didn't require pesticides, irrigation, or fertilizers in order to persist. So looking at these new scales, the micro and the macro scale, using the technology that we've created, I think can make these two spaces become so much more real to us and guide us into decision making into the future. Instead of agriculture being a war where you're fighting against pests and you're fighting against weeds, we can actually create systems where it's not a fight at all. Thank you so much.
I just have a comment on what we might call the not quite late, maybe not quite so great human species. Because we mea culpa ourselves through our days a lot. And I would like to observe that we are part of nature just like everything else. And our presence on this planet in its current state is something that most creatures do. That is, they try to grow into their niche and expand the carrying capacity so that they can reproduce more, because reproducing more is a much better place to be than reproducing less and not even getting to reproduce at all. Reproducing more becomes a big problem eventually, but we reproduce for today. And so everything we see, this building is an extension of our biology. The computer chips are extensions of our biology. And it's a remarkable biology in that respect. And like many other creatures, 99% of which are no longer with us, we have expanded carrying capacity and overshot our niche close to collapse. So we're not that different from lots of the others. And as far as the indigenous tribes, there was an anthropologist, his name is Marshall Salins, and he wrote a book called Stone Age Economics about 40 years ago. And in it, he identified indigenous populations, tribal populations, and hunter-gatherers as the original leisure society. Because for many such tribes and groups, food was readily available. I mean, you're not going to evolve terribly well unless food is pretty readily available for a good part of your time around here. And anthropologists went in and measured the time that they did what we would call work. They might not call it work. They might call, hey, let's go have a hunting party, or let's have a gardening party. And it was about 15 hours a week. And the rest of the time they just did, people type things, did their dances and their stories and all of that. So I think we need to, as Thomas Hobbes, brutish, short, brutish, and whatever it was that he talked. I mean, he was no anthropologist. Nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, the really nasty, brutish, and short lives were happening in England during the Industrial Revolution. But I think that image persists with us, and maybe, we can start to move beyond it, because it's not fair.
Does anyone else have a question?
I actually have two small questions. One had to do with the crop, what looked like large circles that in the growing areas, and I've seen them flying over them and have always wondered what in the world they are. I figured that I later thought it. So that is actually the points where the aquifer is being drained for purposes of one of them. Okay. And the other question for Lincoln has to do with the red oak trees. Are they as fantastic at hosting caterpillars and things that are necessary for birds to feed their young as the white oak is, which is
Well, I think those lists of like these plant species, people observe that the white oak hosts an enormous diversity of insects, and yeah, the red oak does too. And I think there's a lot more to it. So I think it's good to appreciate what we can see the white oak doing, and to also recognize that it's doing a lot more than that. So the red oak, the white oak, and the swamp white oak, and we have nearly 60 species native in the United States. They're all usable for human food and caterpillar food and, and everything, deer food, everything. So yeah.
Great presentations. I had a question on, you didn't mention, this is Mr. Friton, Benjamin. You didn't mention genetically engineered food. What is your take on that?
I did mention that 94% of the corn is. So my take on it. First off, I think that Chris touched on this a little earlier, which is that many of these genetic modifications, which the purpose behind the modifications in the first place, it's debatable whether it was to be able to patent them or whether it was to deal with some of these collateral effects. I believe that they were actually brought and put in place because they were trying to deal with very specific inevitable collateral effects of growing monocultures. So, for example, Roundup resistant corn. You're going to have other plants that are going to want to grow in that system. And this was a way to try to handle that. You have BT, which is corn that actually releases and has an insecticide grow from within it. So if anything tries to consume that corn, the stomach of the insect ruptures. So you see the problem, generally speaking, is that in our current agricultural methodology, you are guaranteed to have something we call pests. We call these things pests, but the reality is that these are things doing their biological purpose, which is to bring balance back to an ecosystem, right? In the same way that we had a huge spike in the number of Scolia dubia wasps because we had an abundance of Japanese beetles, the same thing is going to happen if you have nothing but corn in a space. The things that are going to thrive there are things that eat corn. So you could decide to do that through genetics, or you can decide to think through a different paradigm. What they were trying to do, at least they say they were trying to do, is reduce the amount of pesticide necessary to be able to deal with these things by turning the plant into a pesticide. Now, the biggest problem that I personally have with genetically modified crops is, first off, whenever you're dealing with anything that has been observed in a laboratory, there's a whole host of different variables that don't exist in a laboratory that are going to exist out in the wild, right? And even if you do field studies, say in Hawaii, where we do a lot of field studies, or in other places, that doesn't mean that if you saw no collateral effects there in 1 year, or 2 years, that you wouldn't see different collateral effects somewhere else, right? And then the fact that genetics spread. You can't keep the genetics from one crop from going into the genetics of another crop, which means that you have a situation where if I wanted to breed corn year over year, the beauty of growing annual plants, there's some downside to growing annual plants, but part of the beauty is that every year you plant back that seed, it becomes more accustomed to the things that are happening on your site. That's everything from climactic to the insect pests and things like that. If you have to buy seed every single year from a source that was grown somewhere far away, you're not going to have that, number one. And number two, if I'm trying to grow that seed that I'm replanting and making year over year more accustomed to my site, and my neighbor decides that they want to have some kind of genetically modified, same crop, I can't stop those genetics from coming onto my site. Now, there's a whole thing about litigation I'm not going to go into where they can actually sue you when that genetics gets onto your site. That's pretty messed up. But take it a step further and just say that this is a pollution of the genetics that I'm trying to have on my site, and I have no control over that. That's enough of a problem for me to say that I don't think it's a good idea.
Okay.
Let's give a hand for this, please, too.